The multi-billion-pound fashion industry is in the capital to showcase the Spring-Summer 2014 trends at London Fashion Week. But hidden behind the glitz and glamour of the catwalk shows and parties lies a monopoly of multinational corporations controlling everything from public attitudes to fashion to the media covering the industry. A new book aims to lay bare the conspicuous consumption of the fashion elite. With me is Tansy Hoskins, the author of Stitched Up, the anti-capitalist book of fashion. Welcome. Why do you think serious current affairs media often treats it as a bit of a joke, even though it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, multi-billion-pound industry?
Well, I suppose partly, possibly that's because of like sexism, because a lot of the time it's women who are more interested in fashion or women who are writing about it, so it's not taken seriously. But yeah, it should be taken seriously, as everything within the fashion industry, from like labour rights to climate change to racism and sexism. So yeah, once you start unpicking fashion, it's an incredibly serious topic.
And one of the many horrors you talk about in the book of, I suppose right at the beginning, is the monopoly ownership of fashion. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Well, fashion is an interesting one because it's kind of sold as this industry that's very open and very, sort of embodies creativity. But once you kind of unpick it a bit, you see that actually the ownership of fashion has been stitched up by a very few companies, both in terms of high fashion and high street fashion, and indeed like the fashion media.
You say 35 brands control 60% of the whole luxury goods market.
Yes.
And at Women's Fashion Week, as well as this monopoly, the monopoly brands, they'll be covered by monopoly fashion media, you maintain.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you go into a newsagent and you buy a magazine and you think you're buying like a sort of independent or individually produced magazine, but actually, again, they're all owned by a few enormous media corporations, like Condé Nast, for example. And actually the same goes for the fashion blogs as well. Now most of those have been bought up and are now media platforms that are owned by multinational corporations. So really our kind of common cultural heritage has been monopolised, and it's the same multinational corporations that are deciding what we read about and what we wear and what we think's cool.
It's called the anti-capitalist book of fashion. I have to ask this, what has Karl Marx got to do with Karl Lagerfeld?
Well, for me, everything. I mean, for me, sort of fashion encapsulates everything that's wrong with the labour market, and everything that's wrong with the way capitalism treats the environment and treats human beings. And I think that fashion very much has to be seen as part of capitalism, and because that's the reason why goods are produced at such high volumes and why wages are driven down and down and down, is to increase profits for multinational corporations. So for me, you can't separate fashion from capitalism.
And do you think consciousness on environmental and on labour rights, though, as regards fashion, that we have seen any improvements? I mean, say since the financial crash of 2008, or has it not made much difference?
Well, personally, I'm optimistic. I think that there is quite a high level of consciousness within society today. Particularly, I think about labour rights, particularly since Rana Plaza, the tragedy in Bangladesh.
Didn't the companies just forget about that? All those people dying, and keep producing clothes in those conditions? Well,
I mean, there were more than 1,134 Bangladeshi, mostly women, died in the factory collapse. And actually the companies haven't been able to forget about them. There have been brilliant campaigns run by trade unions, like global trade unions, as well as trade unions in Bangladesh, and also sort of civil society groups and consumers have pressurised companies like H&M and Primark to sign up to the Bangladesh Accord. I mean, there's still things we're waiting for. We're still waiting for decent compensation for the victims and their families, and we're still waiting for proper health and safety. There's a long, long way to go, but I'm quite confident that people are more aware of these issues now and that they want to do something about it, and that they don't want to be wearing clothes that people died to make.
How is the British fashion industry doing in creating jobs?
In terms of the British fashion industry, it's worth about 21 billion pounds to the British economy, and there's about 800,000 jobs within the British fashion industry. But it's interesting when you look at where those jobs are, because once upon a time those jobs would have been manufacturing jobs, they'd have been factory jobs that would have employed, you know, huge swathes of people. Now they're jobs in marketing and design and brand management, so they're jobs and also in retail. Burberry, for example, I mean, Burberry has behaved like disgracefully, in my opinion, because their whole brand is this idea of Britishness and like made in Britain. And they used to have factories in South Wales and in Yorkshire, and they've closed them all down, and, you know, they've sacked thousands of people, and they moved their production overseas. And they didn't move their production overseas because they weren't making money. They were making hundreds of £1 million, but they wanted to make they wanted £1 billion turnover, so they moved their production to China, where it was like slightly cheaper to manufacture.
But the brand management can still be in Britain.
Well, so the headquarters are still in Britain, but that's jobs. Yeah, that's a very small number of jobs. So the people in Yorkshire who used to make the classic Burberry trench coat, you know, they've all lost their jobs. The people in the valleys in Wales who used to make Burberry, they've all lost their jobs. But it kind of follows, like, British fashion manufacturing follows the neoliberal pattern of manufacturing across the board in the UK. It's been a very deliberate strategy of government since Margaret Thatcher to smash the manufacturing industry in this country and to move into things like banking and marketing, which can, as we've seen, can go badly wrong and disappear.
Tansy Hoskins, thank you.